Hi, this one's a little bit spontaneous, but it's something that I find quite easy to just kind of talk about on the go because it's a very philosophical subject, and I've always found that rather I don't want to say easy, but not so difficult. I am a thinker. I think things through, or I try to anyway. So a subject like this, I really don't feel I need to prepare much because I try to honestly speak with conviction and spontaneously. Yeah. Um, so I've come across various forums. I've just come across one now from atheists, and that's not my perception. This is like self-described atheist forums. And I agree with a fair amount of what they say in terms of challenging certain religious orthodoxy and certainly fundamentalist religious dogma. But sometimes I see some rather absurd statements from these groups. I'm not in many of them. I'm sort of in a couple of these groups from invitations from others and so on. I'm not an atheist. I would describe myself as an agnostic deist. You know, if I want to put a label on it, if I want to be precise, that's probably what I am. I'm agnostic in the sense that I am not an atheist and I'm not particularly religious either. Although that's a very simplistic explanation, the origins of Gnosticism is a bit more complex. But anyway, to make it simple, that's why I go for the agnostic thing. And then theism, I do like the idea that there is some sort of deity, not necessarily a deity whose laws and whose dogma is defined by scripture. Um, and that's where I part way with. I come from a Christian background. My parents are Christians. In fact, my father is a clergyman. My mum's a devout Christian as well. Episcopalian clergyman. So you know that is my background. But and there was a time I went to church, partly because it was a family thing, and partly because I wanted to go, and I did. At that time, I was more religiously inclined. As a child, I was in an organization called the Children's Seaside Scripture Society, I think was the acronym, and it was fun. You know, we done. It wasn't. It was a bit happy clappy, but it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was intensive. You know, brainwashing anything like that. But you know, it was more on the evangelical side of things, and throughout my life, I've had some connection in some way or another with the church. Not so much now, but at various points in life. I've also met, you know, people from all religious faiths. I've met Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists. Um, Not all the time. I don't want to imply that it's like you know, I'm constantly in contact with people, but you know, I've had endless dialogues, debates, conversations. So I think I'm fairly well placed to have a sort of let's say religious experience, not conversion or anything like that, but just you know to get some perspective of that world of faith-based thinking. And I've also heard the other side, which is atheism, and I've heard the arguments. But I have noticed that in some of these atheist groups, there tends to be certain sweeping statements and attitudes. Now, before I continue, a disclaimer here. I know that not everyone watching this will agree with me, and some people will be very tempted to have a knee-jerk reaction, and say, Nathan, what about, and they'll give me X, Y, and Z of what religions do. Look, I've called out religious extremism before. I've even made videos about certain religious dogma. Not in-depth theological videos, but just videos exploring. You know, I've been very outspoken about Islamic extremism, and I feel that, especially under Islamic theocracies, human rights are just absolutely trashed. I mean, the sort of things that go on in Iran and Saudi Arabia and anywhere where basically Islam is the form of government, it's you can guarantee human rights abuses. Uh, that's abundantly clear. And you know the whole notion of blasphemy and the way someone could be brutally lynched by a mob over perceived blasphemy. That whole way of thinking is utterly alien to me and scares me, quite frankly. So, no one can accuse me of shying away from talking about those things because I have. But this video is not really about religion, it's more about atheist claims and some of the sweeping statements that they make. And again, this is not talking about every atheist, but the fact of the matter is, in some of these groups, there is a sort of smug self righteousness. This is one of the claims that is made, and I think it's preposterous. That if there was no organized religion, if there was no churches, no mosques, no gurdwaras, then the world would have no problems because there wouldn't be this dogmatic, misplaced sense of morality that you get from religion. And you wouldn't have the hypocrisies within religion, and you wouldn't have religious fanaticism and all the rest of it, and human rights abuses done in the name of religion. Okay, but the notion that therefore the world would have no problems is clearly absurd. And I think there's a little bit of manipulation from hardline atheists in this, and I'll explain why. My obvious follow up is, of course, you've got problems. You would still have crime. You would still have drug abuse. You would still have exploitation. You would still have slavery. You would still have armed conflict over resources. You'd still have pollution. You know, none of those things you could say religion is solely responsible for. In fact, some of them religion has minimal influence on. As influential as religion is, you can't say if you take away all the churches and mosques and all the priests and imams, then you have no drug abuse, right? And this is something that atheists need to accept. There would still be problems. Now, what they follow up is, oh, but we're not saying atheism makes you a good person, whereas religion says that, being a good Christian or a good Muslim does. Okay, atheism doesn't necessarily have that dogmatic thing where if you're an atheist, you're a good person. But I do think that some atheists seem to think that simply being an atheist makes them a better person. And I disagree with that. You have good atheists and you have bad atheists, like every other walk of life, just like you have decent Christians and decent Muslims. I heard, I'm interrupting myself here, but I heard someone recently say that religion would have more respect if the religious practiced what they preached. But the problem with that kind of outlook is you're putting them on a pedestal of perfection. Now, you might argue that they're doing that to themselves because devout Christians are always trying to, look at, is this what the scriptures say and so on. So I suppose they do that to themselves. But it's a bit absurd to say, to make that sort of generalization. Like this guy was saying, oh well, the church practices love and charity, but it preaches love and charity, but never shows it. Well, that's ignoring the fact that there are many Christians, and for that matter, clergy members, missionaries, and others who do try to help society. You know, it's often forgotten that it's often faith-based charities that are on the front line of soup kitchens, of helping the homeless, of helping people in those situations. And I can already hear the retort, oh, but you don't need to be religious to do that. Well, of course not. I agree, you don't have to be religious to do that. I wish dogmatic atheists would at least accept that not everyone who is religious is a brainwashed fanatic. Because they do seem to have that mentality that because religion's so terrible and so destructive, then anyone who's religious must be negatively influenced by it. And they not comprehend that for some people, maybe religion does help their lives. If someone has lost their way in life, I've heard cases of people who've been long-term drug addicts, who've been involved in a world of crime, a very dark world, a very dark past, and they found faith, and it really has helped their lives. Now that's irrefutable. Now you might argue, an atheist might say, "Oh well, they could change their lives by going down Alcoholics Anonymous, by going through penal rehabilitation," and they point to other factors. But I just wish they would be open-minded enough to acknowledge that maybe for some people faith does help. And I think that I understand their argument, the basic argument that you can't prove there's a higher deity. I'm not arguing with that because I think it's a rational way of thinking. The notion that this this higher deity just created everything out of nothing. And I totally understand where atheists are coming from, but I do get a little bit irritated by the self righteousness that some atheists have. And this idea, oh, I'm an atheist, I'm smarter than that. Just these religious people are just, they believe in fairy tales and they're idiots and they're brainwashed by a book. Well, it never makes you come across well by being pompous in that way. You don't win arguments that way. Maybe they don't want to. Maybe they're fine being having that self righteousness. But to me, their attitude is no better than self righteous religionists who look down on others because they don't have faith. Um, there should be an aspect of mutual respect. Now, would I rather live in an atheist state or a theocracy? Probably the atheist state. Okay, but another thing atheists need to accept is that religious freedom is also a human right. Okay, so you can point out all the bad things that happen under religious control. Fair enough. I agree with that. It does happen. And fine, let's call it out. But if you want, because this is another thing, some atheists really would like a situation where religion simply made illegal and people of faith are basically driven into the shadows and they're forced to read the Bible or the Quran in dark corners because if they even talk about God, this is where I disagree with atheists. They have a tantrum at the mere mention of God. Um, why don't you just say, "Oh well, that's not my way of thinking. Have a nice day." There has to be a question of mutual respect here, and I do think some atheists, given I know this for a fact because I've seen this attitude that they just want to make religion illegal. Now, if that's your attitude, and I know, probably atheists watching this will say, oh, Nathan, that's not my view. Fair enough, but some atheists do have this view. They do. I've seen it. Firstly, it's not practical. Even if you made it illegal, how on earth do you take a country like the UK? We have the number of Christians, practicing Christians is declined. The number of practicing Muslims possibly well, the issue of practicing is a complex subject, but let's say there's around 2 million Muslims in the UK. Perhaps, I don't know what the figures are, but it's going to be considerably more Christians, or at least people from a Christian background. Church attendance has fallen. Then you got other faith groups, Jews, Sikhs, Hindus, and so on. Let's say tomorrow these hardline atheists had their way and it's illegal to practice religion, right? So they'd have to close every church, every mosque, every temple, every gurdwara, right? Then you've got a major civil liberty case, a major civil liberty question. You close all the churches, gurdwaras, etc. Right, then what? Then people of faith will protest, but then you say, okay, well, we need to keep this under control, so we will fine them if they talk about God publicly. We will drive them underground. And what you end up with is just another form of totalitarianism. So to those atheists, I would say you're no better than theocrats. You're really not, because what you want to do is take away the freedom of conscience from people of faith. Um, so to me, that way of thinking is no better than religious fanatics who want to punish non-believers, because hardline atheists want to punish believers. What's the difference? Maybe the way they go about it would be different. But what, for example, is happening now in China, the mass incarceration of Uyghur Muslims, Christians arrested, churches demolished. This is very, very real persecution of faith groups. Now, atheists will say, oh, don't blame atheism for that. But there's no getting away from the fact that the Chinese Communist Party have atheism in their constitution. Atheism. In theory, they sanction five religions, which is Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, and traditional folk religions. They're in theory sanctioned, but the reality is it is very, very difficult to be a person of faith in China today. That's a fact. And I think that is just as much a human rights issue as people being persecuted in Iran. Um, you know, Well, I really don't see the difference. And atheists, they would say, well, atheism is not a religion, that's just a political issue. But they can't deny the fact that the CCP uses atheism. So if they're calling on moderate religious people to call out theocracy, I would say, okay, why do you condemn the Chinese Communist Party for using atheism in that way? That seems reasonable to me. Um, but yeah, I just feel that there is a slightly arrogant notion with some of this atheist thinking, and it puts me off atheism. I mean, I don't think I could be an atheist anyway, because it's something I've given a lot of thought to. And for me, it's a rather, call it what you want, but I just don't find comfort from the idea that when you die, there is nothing, that your body decomposes and that is it. You've no conscience, that's it, it's just done. I don't find that comforting. I find that incredibly bleak. Now, an atheist might be more optimistic and say, well, your body decomposes, you become part of, the earth again. And it's a kind of recycling of nature, I guess. That's a bit more of an optimistic outlook. But yeah, I just get a little bit tired of this self-righteous attitude from some atheists, um, because it is obvious and it's palpable that I'm an atheist, therefore I've got superior intelligence. You're religious, so you must be a brainwashed fool. You don't win arguments that way. I mean, what gives an atheist a right to mock someone if they find prayer comforting in their dying moments? It's not hurting anyone. That's not imposing on anyone else. What gives an atheist a right to laugh and ridicule that? That's something I really dislike about certain atheist thinking. I emphasize certain atheist thinking. I am by no means attacking all atheists here. But I've made videos similar to this before, and I've noticed that I've got a lot of thumbs down because I think some atheists don't like being called out for their hypocrisy. And yeah, it is hypocrisy because if you're criticizing religion for being totalitarian, yet you're saying let's ban all religion and let's drive religious people underground, then that's just as totalitarian. And if you're saying, oh, we're not going to force them to do anything, okay, well then how do you stop religion? How? You'd have to re-educate them, and then you basically end up as a sort of communist. So what I envisage is healthy secularism. What I mean by that is there has to be a separation of the state and religion because we cannot have religious groups pressuring the government to make rules that affect everyone else. But by the same token, I do not want to live in a society where religious people cannot even talk about their faith. For example, let's say you have those, they tend to be Christian, street preachers. Frankly, they can be a bit irritating, they can be a bit loud, but frankly, they're not hurting anyone really. Most people walk by and see them for what they are, kind of eccentric street preachers. Now, in a free society, people should have the right to challenge them. If they're coming out with misogynistic attitudes or homophobic attitudes, and you're gay or you're a woman, then by all means challenge them. But it's freedom of speech. They're not standing there and saying, I demand you convert to Christianity. They're saying, find Jesus, find the Lord, and you will be saved. Most people see it for what it is. So, I think militant atheists would make something like that illegal. I'm not sure that it should be. I think if they're hit mongering, if they're saying, oh, you're gay, you will burn in the pits of hell, then that could be seen as hate speech and they should be prosecuted for that. But simply standing in the street and saying, in my experience, finding Jesus helped my life, I think it's harmless. I think it's maybe not harmless. I guess you could say that it's indoctrinating more vulnerable people, but there is a freedom of conscience issue at stake there. I remember talking to a Singaporean friend of mine. Now, she's a lot more religious than me. And I made this point to her. I said, some people find that off putting, this sort of proselytizing. And she said, well, think of it this way. If you listen to a particular music album, or you read a particularly good book, or you saw a good film, you talk to your friends about it, you kind of promote it. And that's how I see me talking about faith. So she was saying when she's talking about God, she's not forcing others to agree. She's just talking about something that she'd recommend it has been good for her. So thinking of that, I've met Christian evangelicals, and honestly, almost to a person, I haven't found myself intimidated or bullied or pressured. At times, I found them a little bit deluded, and some of their arguments, especially, I remember speaking to a young guy who was an evangelical Christian, and he was trying to convince me that there was dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible because he mentioned that behemoths are written there somewhere. And I made the point to him, well, a behemoth just means a large beast. That could be a giraffe or an elephant. So it doesn't really prove anything. I'm all for debate, and I'm all for, certainly, if you have someone who's being a pest and they are imposing on someone and saying you have to listen to this, or they're being openly judgmental, because some Christians need to understand that the way they come across can be, come across as quite judgmental. But honestly, in my experience, I've also had it from some Muslims when I was in Speaker's Corner. Oh, it would have been about 10 years ago now. A very friendly guy came up to me, and he said, "My friend, do you like curry?" And I said, "Yeah, sometimes." And he invited me to the Finsbury Park Mosque because it was like they were having um, I forget what the occasion was, but that was kind of his little catch. And I said, "Well, to be honest, mate, I need to catch a train and I'll be there." But it was very civil. He wasn't talking down to me. He wasn't. I knew what he was doing. I could see what the pitch was. Oh yeah, I'll bring you here and try to convert you. But you know, really, that sort of thing, I wouldn't make any laws against that, unless it was in the vein of bullying or pressuring people. So, for example, in university campuses, I've no problem with a Christian society or an Islamic society or something, so long as they are not bullying other students and so long as they are not spreading hate. Now, the problem with the likes of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which was an Islamic student movement, was they were basically speaking against secularism. They were trying to impose Islamic dogma on the wider society, and that's why there's long been a campaign to have them prescribed. I think they should be. They denounce violence, but they are very much in favor of ultimately installing an Islamist theocracy. I have a book by Ed Hussein, and he talks at length about how he was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir and sort of indoctrination that goes on. So I do think we need to be very wary about organisations like that. However, I wouldn't go so far as to say that religious people can't express themselves at all. So much of this is a balancing act. Now, atheists, particularly those who have come from theocracies, say you have an atheist who's come from Iran, they would have very hardline views on this, and they would say something like, "They should ban all the Muslims and outlaw that completely." Now, if they've been tortured or they've had that real world experience, I can understand the depth of their emotions, or at least I can sympathize with it. I can see where they're coming from. I can see why they would hate Islam. But ultimately, the United Kingdom is not Iran, and we also have to get the balance right of standing up for our values, not tolerating religious extremism, but not going so far in the other direction that we discriminate. That's an important thing to get. Now, when we have a situation like the Batley School protest, I think we need to send out a very loud and clear message that that sort of mentality, i.e., any notion of punishing blasphemy or sending death threats to a teacher, that has no place on this island. And I think those who were most vocally involved in that protest, and especially those sending death threats against a teacher, if they're foreign citizens, they should be deported. If they're British citizens, they should be put on the terror watch list. If they're sending death threats against a teacher, it is sickening that that happened in this country, and apparently it happened at another school in Sheffield. We also, as a nation, need to have the backbone to stand up to the likes of Imran Khan in Pakistan, tell him clearly, you can have these backward blasphemy laws, we do not. Blasphemy laws have no place in a democracy. Why? Because they impose on the majority. That is a religious imposition on the majority. But honestly, I am just as uneasy about what China is doing to the Uyghur Muslims as I am about what Iran is doing to Christians or so-called apostates. Ultimately, if I was to have any dogma, it would be a belief in human rights. And I don't think the atheists can claim an absolute monopoly on that. Atheists cannot say we are the safeguarders of human rights. Not always. Not in historic examples where there has been state persecution of religious people using atheism as its logic. Now, if you say that's nothing to do with atheism, then really, how is that any different from the religious saying, oh, well, ISIS has nothing to do with Islam? What's the difference in terms of the connection? So I would say to those atheists who don't like, communist China being brought up, okay, well then denounce it. Denounce what China is doing to Uyghur Muslims. Denounce China demolishing churches. If you really don't want that to be associated with atheism, then denounce it and say that they're misusing atheism. Otherwise, silence speaks volumes. Thanks for watching.